So today we're pleased to welcome Jon Gertner, author of The Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation. In this book, Gertner unveils the unique magic of Bell Labs through the eyes and actions of its scientists. Even more importantly, he reveals the forces that set off such an explosion of creativity. Jon has also been a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, where he writes about business, technology, and society. So please join me in welcoming Jon.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. One of the strange things about working on a book for 5 years, which I'll put up there, oops, sorry. There we go, is that you're on your own for a while. You're really living this introverted existence, and then you're done with the book, and everybody expects you to be this wonderfully extroverted person who can deliver dynamic speeches and captivate audiences. I think I can write better than I can speak, but I'll do my best. Today I'm going to talk about a little bit about Bell Labs. It was, it was a huge endeavor. It was a huge organization. It lasted in its, I guess, real sort of pure incarnation before the phone monopoly was broken up from 1925 till 1984. Early on when I was working on the book, I realized I could probably spend the rest of my life writing a book about Bell Labs. I mean, there was a sort of bottomless amount of information, and if you guys ever want to archive it, that would be great because it's all sort of millions of documents sort of arranged pell-mell in the archives. So this was a kind of classic endeavor, I think, where there was actually too much information, and sort of the challenge was to sort through and find a way to tell the story. Does everybody, I don't know if everyone knows what Bell Labs was, but it was the R&D arm of AT&T. AT&T was a different organization back then. It was the telephone monopoly. It controlled between 80 and 90% of the telephone service in the United States. AT&T was vertically integrated. It had Bell Labs as its R&D organization on the bottom. It controlled a manufacturing company called Western Electric, too. AT&T itself ran the long-distance service, and then it owned either pieces or whole entire parts of these local operating companies around the country. It was the biggest company in the world at the time. It employed the most people. It was the most valuable. It was a true colossus at the time. The reason for me at least, to write about Bell Labs was kind of this, which is probably an infographic you definitely cannot read from there. But a guy at the Times did this for me when I wrote a story a couple weeks back about why it matters. But all those little blurbs there are Bell Labs innovations that, as we move along the timeline, kind of coalesce into this wondrous electronic world we have today. And just on a quick short list, if I were going to tick off some of the big accomplishments and innovations there, probably the things got rolling in its golden age in 1947 with the invention of the transistor. Many iterations of the transistor followed. Many process innovations for the transistor followed as well. The silicon solar cell came out of there. Digital communications and information theory came out of there. Cellular telephone networking came out of there. Unix, the C language, digital signal processing. I'm sure I've left out a few. Communication satellites, wavelength multiplexing. Fiber optics themselves were not originated there, but fiber optic systems did. So you can sort of see that these were true platform innovations on which the industries of today were built. And for me, the question was, why did that happen? Why was this one place so creative, so innovative for so long? One reason was it was connected to a monopoly, and it had this endless stream of money, and it could hire the best people, create really any kind of equipment. Nothing was too expensive. It could think long-term in a way that is harder today, I think. It could do science experiments in a way that's harder today, too, for corporations to sort of invest in things that are quite so risky. Anyway, quickly, I think today I'll talk about two innovations in particular and maybe give you a flavor for how innovation happened there, which is definitely different from today. And also, you can ask me questions after, but also I think these examples kind of work together in a complementary way and kind of explain a little bit about how things began. This is Murray Hill. which some of you may have heard of or maybe not. The original Bell Labs was actually here in Manhattan on West Street, about 20 blocks, 25 blocks, a few less actually, about 10, 15 blocks south of here. In the early 40s, they built this as a sort of escape from the city. They wanted to do their experiments away from the dirt and the noise and the vibrations of New York. This was the first building. Many more followed. It became quite an enormous complex. It still stands today. It's actually the headquarters of Alcatel-Lucent at the moment. But in the time this photo was taken, which was, I think, about 1946 or 47, it was just about entering its golden period, and it was where a lot of the great researchers who later became famous worked. There were a couple other campuses in New Jersey as well, but this was really, in that era, the primary one. This guy on the left was Mervyn Kelly, and in some ways he really forms the backbone of my book. He started at Western Electric in 1917 and came over to Bell Labs in 1925. The picture on the left is him in his early career. The one on the right is Kelly right before he retired in the late 50s. It's also probably a good ad for why I shouldn't smoke cigarettes. Kelly was a heavy smoker, and it aged him pretty seriously. His first job at Bell Labs, or his first big job, was to be in charge of vacuum tube development. And vacuum tubes, as you may know, is sort of one of these great technologies that has entered the dustbin of history, almost, unless you're a guitar player and you use tube amps, or you're into high-powered radio transmission, and they still require some of that. But at the time, the vacuum tube was really the great invention of Kelly's time. And what it did, as you may know, is it allowed telephone calls to actually travel across the country. Telephone signals were not digital at the time. They were traveling by waves. They are weak. They attenuate. The vacuum tubes, and in fact, this is the one Kelly worked on for years and years, called the 101D, was also called the repeater tube. And these tubes were spaced every 50 to 75 to 100 miles across the country at repeater stations. And phone calls that were going from New York, for instance, to Menlo Park would travel through many of these repeater stations as the signal would be amplified and sent on farther along the line. Kelly was really good at his job. He ran the vacuum tube shop, and it gave him sort of a deep appreciation of a kind of incremental innovation, I guess you might say. He worked on getting costs down and the life of these things up. I think he brought the hours that they could run from something like 1,000 hours to 80,000 hours, which was a phenomenal achievement, and obviously the economics of that were tremendous as well. But he fundamentally had a problem with vacuum tubes. He probably knew as much or more about vacuum tubes than anybody in the country. He felt deeply that they were a flawed technology. He would complain to his wife that they broke all the time. The other problems with vacuum tubes is they were fairly large, as you can see. This one is just a little bit smaller than an old-style incandescent light bulb. They used great amounts of power. They gave off tremendous amounts of heat. They had to warm up to function, so they couldn't function cold. And it had bothered him. He was always wondering if there was something else that could replace him. Kelly had a best friend at Bell Labs, and his name was Clinton Davisson. He won the Nobel Prize in the late 1930s. But before either one of these guys became famous, they shared a laboratory in the teens and 20s at Bell Labs. And they were kind of the original odd couple. Kelly was robust. He had extraordinary amounts of energy. I wonder if he might have had ADD. He was, in those days before then, he was always on the move. He was not somebody who would linger over things too long. And Davisson was kind of the opposite. Kelly was a fairly good-sized man. Davisson was incredibly thin, phlegmatic, slow-moving. I think Davisson weighed like 110 pounds sometimes. He would often be sick. He'd go home and he'd wear his stocking cap and his little nightgown and sit in his study at home and write equations, and Kelly would go visit him and see how he was doing. They shouldn't have got along in theory, but they did, and Kelly actually was awed by Davisson. And in some ways it speaks to why Kelly was so good at what he did and why Bell Labs became what it became. And the thing about Davisson was that he couldn't help his colleagues with the actual engineering of the projects that they were working on. But what he could do is he could answer questions nobody else in the staff of Bell Labs could do. He would give them a deeper, more fundamental understanding, for instance, with vacuum tubes, of what was going on deep within the processes of these tubes. And what Kelly realized was, yes, that Davisson could answer questions nobody else could, but that by imparting a kind of fundamental understanding of what was happening with these electronic devices, the staff under him on the tube shop, for instance, could make improvements that were not just twice as good or 3 times as good, but orders of magnitude better. It showed him that knowledge gives an unbelievable power beyond just mere tinkering. And in many ways, Davisson became the model for those Bell Labs researchers in later years. Not everybody was in research at Bell Labs. A lot of people were in development. In fact, the majority were. But those researchers who were pursuing pure knowledge and could be tapped for that, Davisson was Kelly's model. So it's one day in 1937, and Kelly's walking down the hall, and he's likely on his way to visit Davisson, because Davisson shares an office with a guy right below him on that picture. Davisson's on the right, and Shockley, William Shockley, is right below him. Shockley had joined Bell Labs in 1936. Kelly had hired Shockley. Shockley was brilliant. He grew up in Palo Alto. He went to graduate school at MIT. And for whatever reason that day, Davisson likely was not there. Kelly decides to give Shockley a speech. And Kelly tells him, rather than talk about vacuum tubes that day, he's complaining about switches, these relay switches that clicked on and off, and they were the other essential kind of part of the Bell system. They were electromagnetic. They were slow, in a manner of speaking, because they weren't electronic. They clicked and moved. They broke fairly often. They wore out. They were a huge expense. There were millions of them in the system. And he told Shockley that day in 1937, and it's something Shockley would remember for the rest of his life, if we could just get these switches out of the system somehow, if there was some way to replace them, it would be just an enormous improvement for the Bell system. So there are then these 2 components, the amplifying tubes and the switches, both of which are essential to making the Bell system function, both of which are problematic, and Shockley takes this to heart. The war intervenes in 1941, and all of Bell Labs starts working on war-related stuff. And then, right after the war, Kelly creates what later became known as a solid-state team. He got a group together at Bell Labs, put Shockley in charge, and asked them to look into the nature of semiconductors. And semiconductors were a relatively newly, I guess you could say, semi-understood material at the time. They had become very valuable in wartime radar, but Kelly and others at Bell Labs felt that there was still a good deal amount to know about them that they did not. And the semiconductor group was interesting for a couple reasons. It sounds a little bit obvious today, but it was tremendously interdisciplinary, which Kelly personally believed was necessary. So it wasn't just physicists working together, and it wasn't just experimentalists and theorists. There were chemists, there were electrical engineers, there were circuitry experts. Everybody was pitching in with somewhat complementary talents. Not everybody agreed. There was a nice amount of creative tension as well. The second thing about the group that was fairly interesting is that in some ways Kelly's entire career had been built upon his achievements with the vacuum tube, and what he's doing in some ways is trying to get away or get around that innovator's dilemma. He's essentially creating a team that, if it succeeds, will make his entire previous career at Bell Labs and all his fame really somewhat irrelevant. From 1945 to 1947, the transistor group goes to work. They're not the transistor group, excuse me, they're the semiconductor group. And in fall of 1947, 2 guys working under Shockley, John Bardeen and Walter Bratton, come up with this, which is very ugly, but quite miraculous. It's about, if anybody's ever seen it, it's actually about the size of the tip of my pinky, so it's fairly small. And that sheet of crystal underneath the arrowhead is germanium. It's not silicon, it's lightly doped germanium. And on the side of that arrowhead are sort of gold wires coming in there. And on the day before Christmas Eve, Bardeen and Bratton with Shockley there too demonstrated it for the Bell Labs executives, and they amplified their voice somewhat like 18 times. And they agreed that it was something tremendously big. So they found this thing, this putative replacement for the vacuum tube, and it would seem that the world would change. But it didn't, because what they discovered pretty quickly was how hard these things were to make. In those early days, I mean, I would go through all these stories of Bell Labs guys bringing in military generals or heads of corporations to see this wondrous new transistor, but if it was a humid day, the thing would stop working. If somebody slammed a door nearby, it wouldn't work. There were tremendous challenges of manufacturability. Eventually those were worked out, and eventually too Shockley created the idea for something called the junction transistor. Still later there were other things like field effect transistors that came into play, and one by one these problems of manufacturing were solved at Western Electric factories with the help of the development team at Bell Labs. And by the early 1950s these transistors were just starting to make their way into the electronics industry. And at about that same time, in actually the same lab that the transistor was made, these three guys were working on it. It was 1954, so the development of the transistor was continuing, but it was, again, starting to infiltrate culture and business. And the guy on the far left is Gerald Pearson, who actually shared an office with Walter Brattain, who was one of the inventors of the transistor. And Pearson, with the guy on the right, Cal Fuller, were working on something called a silicon solar rectifier. I'm sorry, a silicon power rectifier, excuse me. Pearson was an experimental physicist. Fuller was a chemist. And what Fuller would do was he would make these pieces of silicon in his lab that were diffused, and he would put these light layers of slightly impure, slightly doped, we call it now. They didn't call it that at the time. They called it N or P silicon on these silicon wafers, and he would bring it to Pearson, and they would try and work out this device they were making for the phone system. What Pearson started to realize was that this stuff that Fuller was making was incredibly photosensitive, not just surprisingly so, but it had a larger effect than anything Pearson could find in the science literature and anything he had ever seen before. And that struck him. What also struck him was he knew a guy in the middle from college named Chapin. Now, all these guys actually worked in different buildings, and they just kind of serendipitously almost found each other. And what Pearson knew about Chapin was that Chapin was actually looking for a way to solve a problem that he was working on at Bell Labs that had to do with those old repeater stations I was talking about. They were spaced, again, every 50 to 100 miles around the country, and they amplified phone calls. In some rural areas, these repeater stations didn't have a real reliable power source. Especially in the South, they used dry cell batteries that would sometimes stop working, or they used diesel generators. And what Pearson realized, thinking that he had been having lunch with Chapin and knew what he was trying to work on, was that this thing he and Fuller were also working on too could possibly be used as a power source for this problem. So the three men, went to work on this, and eventually they came out with what was called the Bell Solar Battery, or the Silicon Solar Cell. And it was tried in 1955 at Americus, Georgia, and it was very successful. I'll talk about the economics of it in a second, but in terms of its function, it worked very well. And in fact, it's interesting too, because I live in New Jersey, and these are going up on every phone pole now too, except they're a lot thinner, and obviously the efficiencies are much higher. Just a couple things to just draw from these two examples, I think, or at least things that I found interesting as I was researching and thinking hard about what it means. I think first, in these two cases, it can demonstrate that innovation is often a response to needs and to problems, rather than that classic lone inventor coming up with the idea. That it's rarely an unprovoked idea, that at least for the transistor team, they were looking into the deeper nature of their materials, and in the back of their mind they had, at least Shockley very much had that idea that if they found something it could be quite useful for the phone system, it could get rid of those proliferating switches and tubes. The solar cell, for instance, was a very clear response to a problem that Chapin had. I think the second thing we learn is that we're not very good at perceiving breakthroughs sometimes when they happen. The transistor ended up on page 46 of the New York Times, and it was actually not even at the top of this kind of trivial column. It was located deep down at the bottom, saying, well, these Bell Labs guys might have a replacement for the vacuum tube. At Bell Labs, they thought it was quite a big deal, but it was hard for the rest of the country and, in fact, the world to perceive its immediate import, or at least most people. With the Bell Solar Battery, which is quite interesting, it was almost the exact opposite. It was a miracle. It was a pivotal juncture of mankind. It was on the front page of most newspapers in the country. We had harnessed the power of the sun, and I'm a big solar power advocate, so I'm not mocking it, but at the time it seemed like things had changed dramatically, that we had tapped now a cheap, inexhaustible source of power that would forever change our culture and our society. But to build on that too, I think there's a third thing, and that's that invention can be fairly rapid and sudden and dramatic, but innovation is really long and hard. And I think you see that with the transistor, not just in how long it took to develop it to the point where it worked, but also it was quite expensive at the beginning. And in those early days, it was really kept alive by defense contractors. I mean, Bell Labs put them into the Bell system, but defense contractors in the US government were ordering them because the low power requirements of transistors and their tiny size made them quite invaluable in submarines and airplanes. And the extra expense, because they were much more expensive than vacuum tubes at the time, was outweighed by those other attributes. The silicon solar cell wasn't quite as hard to develop. However, it was incredibly expensive. I think in a year after they had developed this device, Chapin, one of the inventors, calculated that if he wanted to outfit his house with enough solar cells to actually power all his appliances, it would cost $1.5 million. It's obviously, we're at that point where the cost per cell is coming down dramatically, but obviously the economics made it completely a non-starter, essentially. And in fact, they pretty much realized this after they did that installation, that demonstration in Americus, Georgia, that for the amount of, for the expense of creating these solar devices at the time, it just wasn't worth it. Fourth, I think we see from these two examples, at least at Bell Labs, that there was no set way of making a breakthrough. The transistor was an orchestrated, mid-sized team. It was very carefully created, and it was very closely managed in many respects. There was a good deal of freedom there, but it was always, everybody kept tabs on progress, and there were very frequent meetings. The solar cell, as I said, all those guys worked in different buildings. They found the right problem at the right time with the right people at the right moment. It was fairly serendipitous. Finally, I think that even when we think we understand the value of breakthroughs, maybe we don't. I think early on the transistor was obviously viewed as a replacement for the vacuum tube, and it was. But its real value has been in computers, obviously, in the chips and that power our phones and laptops and God knows everything else. I think when I was looking in the archives at AT&T, there was only one letter, as far as I could find, from an MIT professor named Jay Forrester a couple days after the transistor was invented. And he wrote to these guys and he said, "Hey, can I get a couple samples? I think those have some real applications in this computer apparatus that I'm building." And it's a little unclear from the responses at Bell Labs whether they realized how valuable that would be for computers or not. What they did do was immediately write back to Forrester, and they were not writing back to everybody because they got tons of letters begging for samples, but they wrote back to him immediately and said, "Yes, they're on their way. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make it easier for you." And a quick other thing, as for how we kind of don't know if we understand the value of what a innovation might do, is that sometimes I'm asked, what was the great thing that came out of Bell Labs, or the greatest? A very hard question, actually, and sometimes I find it depends what field of technology you work in. You can get very different answers. But I usually say the transistor, and I think it's widely sort of understood to be the great invention of the 20th century. But I wonder in 20 years if maybe the solar cell might compete in some ways, if it's a matter of where you are in time when you answer that question. One thing I know for sure is that it wasn't the Picturephone, but the Picturephone's kind of interesting too, and I'll just end on a quick note here. The Picturephone was just a colossal flop. This is the Model 1, which was unveiled at the 1964 World's Fair. They actually redid it before it was rolled out to the public in 1968. The Model 2 was a little sleeker. It was a square actual model. But it was, in the days before the web, the internet, everybody else had to have a picture phone if you wanted to talk to somebody on a picture phone. The system wasn't ready. It was fabulously expensive. It was, I think hundreds of millions of dollars went down the tubes on that. It's a classic example, I think, of how an innovator can maybe get the sort of right idea, but if you're wrong by about 40 years, you're in trouble. And one thing that actually came out of the Picturephone research was that Bell Labs always had these guys who were sort of, not just building these things, but in the research department were sort of testing them with subjects and psychology and human factors type work. And they realized it was actually easier to lie to somebody while you're talking on a picture phone than if you're just talking to someone on a telephone. And apparently you attend to the content and truth of the conversation much better if you're just talking on the phone. I don't know if the lesson to that is if you want to lie to somebody, call them on Skype or have a chat with them on the web or not. So I mean, that gives you a little bit of flavor for the labs, I think, at that particular time. There's many more in the book. It's a long book. It gets into all these questions of policy and monopoly, what innovation is, how it differs from invention, how our world has changed, and how companies like you guys have taken up the mantle to some extent of how innovation happens and how it's become more distributed, with science maybe more relegated to our national laboratories and our universities. But it has a little bit of, hopefully this gives you a little bit of flavor. The overriding, I think, point I just maybe like to make in closing is that, I think these two examples and many others in the book really show that a small number of people working within a large organization can make just unbelievable changes in the world. And I don't mean just a kind of social impact in how we live, but also just a huge economic impact when we consider the platform industries that came out of these two inventions, and those ripples that are still really spreading out from them. And obviously it wasn't just Bell Labs. Other people picked up on this and made it better and better and better. And there's a whole other story of what was going on the West Coast and Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel and how they made it better. But still, from this one place, came what has been, millions of jobs and a real revolution. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions if anyone wants to ask anything. Yes, sure. Oh, I can't. It's a little bright, so I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, hi.
I don't know if you've had a tour of the building or other Google facilities. Okay, but there's a real estate and workplace services group that has taken a lot of effort to design the physical spaces to encourage interaction and informal. I wonder if you could say something about, I think this has been in some reviews of your book, about the physical layout of some of the Bell Labs facilities that encouraged interaction.
Yeah, that old slide of Murray Hill that I put up, I mean, they created these epically long hallways so people could interact, and made it almost imperative that you would bump into people. At the same time, they situated, they didn't sequester departments. Mervyn Kelly was quite intent on mixing development people in with the research people, abutting chemistry, physics, and metallurgy. It, in some ways, seemed like it didn't have a rhyme or reason, but it worked very well. Another example of that is the MIT Rad Lab, which you may have heard about too, which was sort of a little bit of chaos, but was a very creative environment. Kelly was a big believer that the great ideas don't come from like-minded people talking to each other. They come from that interface of people with different points of view and different expertise. Yeah, sure.
This seems like one hell of a thing to devote 5 years to. What put you onto it?
That's a great question. I grew up near Bell Labs in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. So, and my dad did not work there, although he was a scientist. But I am a journalist. I was writing about technology and society and economics to some extent, and I was particularly interested in innovation. And I was looking for a book project after writing a lot of long stories for the New York Times Magazine, wondering, what I could really devote a lot of time to. And I'd been writing about innovation at Toyota and some other companies, and it occurred to me that I really did want to write about Bell Labs. It was a great place. I didn't really think that it would take 5 years. And I think the original plan was 2 years, and then I remember just that first year driving back from interviews with veterans or going to, at the time, Homedale, the old labs was still open, and there was Murray Hill, and I just, would be both excited by the amount of stuff that there was to write about, but also sometimes with just a pounding headache by how difficult the task was going to be, and it was difficult, and it was. I'm sure all books are difficult in their own way. I think in this case, it's sort of with Bell Labs, it's like, which story do you want to tell? And some people have read the book who even had nice things about it, said you don't write much about Unix and C, and that's true. And I think that's, to me, that was a little different than the story I was telling about 5 people who formed the core of my narrative. I think the Computer Labs at Bell Labs is going to be a great book in itself one day, but that was not this particular one. So narrowing it down and figuring out a way I could somehow manage the story of this place was also a great challenge. Yeah. Anyone else? I'm not an engineer, so you guys could totally stump me if you want, but no. All right.
Well, first of all, let me say I look forward to the computer sciences book that you're going to write later. Big surprise, a lot of us from Bell Labs ended up here.
Yeah.
What else was sort of the legacy of Bell Labs? When there was the big earthquake in '84, but in my experience, at least, it still took a while for things to shake out.
Yeah.
It wasn't really till roughly about the same time as the dot-com boom before you started seeing the major exodus. Where did people go? I mean, did they retire? Did they retire in place?
Yeah.
What happened?
It's a great question. I was looking for a metaphor in the book for that. I called it an inheritance in some ways, that it was like sort of this vast sum that got split apart amongst descendants. It's true. There's a good amount of, I think, momentum after the breakup, and Bell Labs was still a very, very good industrial lab for a number of years after, and stuff. They're still doing good stuff too, although the mission is much more narrow. Some people were split off into the math folks. Some went to the Shannon Labs at AT&T when that was created. Some went to Bellcore. Some went to academia. Some went to the West Coast, where they've realized they could actually make more money than they ever thought possible. Some retired, and that's true. And some did stay there, because, again, there was this momentum where some of the older people could really stay there. And at the time, of the breakup, it wasn't necessarily, it was very unclear. In fact, reading the press in the mid-'80s about what would happen to the great AT&T and Bell Labs, there was no sense that it was somehow doomed, or that there would be such disruptive changes. And in fact, it was going to be AT&T and IBM which were going to compete in the computer business. And that was going to be the big square off. Yeah.
It's funny, too, because there was maybe a lot of inertia. I mean, when I joined in '81, there was this weekly publication called the Bell Labs News, and at the back were all the anniversaries.
Yeah.
And every week, there was at least one person celebrating almost inevitably his 40th anniversary at Bell Labs, which is just unimaginable today.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. It was a gold watch sort of place, I suppose, that doesn't exist anymore, or does exist, but certainly not in technology. And I don't think. Certainly, the book is not an act of nostalgia. I think it's interesting that things have changed, and as a journalist, it's interesting to watch things become faster, companies more agile, to see what happens when engineers and entrepreneurs can switch companies quickly. But there was something to say about that institutional knowledge. It was really there, and you could tap it, and those guys, knew stuff, and in that sense, it was very valuable. And that things, if they moved slower, they could take the long view in a way that obviously could pay off in very dramatic ways. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Do you think this notion of the research lab is even economically feasible today? I seem to be reading more about sort of the decline of these research labs, like with Park and such, than any kind of successes, like maybe Microsoft Research, but beyond that, I can't think of any dedicated research labs that would have the success of Bell Labs.
Would you call Google X a research lab, by the way? I'm just curious.
Well, it's interesting. We met, actually, my group is involved with innovation, and we met with some of the people from Google X and who came from Microsoft, and they say it's an entirely different model. It's not sort of the academic research model that was ever practiced at Bell Labs or that's done at Microsoft Research. It's much more applied and practical, and I think more short-term than sort of the very long-term thinking that happened at Bell Labs.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it seems like we've lost a lot since then.
Yeah, I believe me, I struggled for years on that question of how to, does one... Eventually, I just had to sit with the contradiction that seemed to me to have no resolution, that monopolies are bad for consumers. They limit choice, they can slow the rate of innovation, they can increase prices dramatically, and yet they also created this curious institution of Bell Labs that could take this long view because it was attached to a parent company, and therefore it could think long term and it could terminate research without any problem at all and just move on to the next thing and just write it off. Do I think research labs are dead? I think it's really hard for a company to fund it and justify it, and I think it's especially hard for a company there can be like, even if hypothetically a corporation were to invest largely in a sort of pure research endeavor, it seems to me it would just be so vulnerable to a boom-bust cycle that to take the long view would be very hard. What happens when you have a bad year for revenues or when growth slows? That's a pretty expensive endeavor sometimes. I think technologies can make research cheaper now in some ways than they were back then with computing. But I do think that to capture the value, to invest in a pure research lab is very hard for a corporation because it's very hard to capture the value of doing basic science, and the risks are quite high, and the risk of failure is tremendous. So I don't know what the answer is right now with the distributed model of universities and national laboratories and then private sector. Is it in some as good? I think it's a great question. I like to talk about it. I come down in different ways on that, but if anybody wants to chime in on that, I'm very interested in what you think. Yeah.
So the computer science research lab in the 60s and 70s had a real reputation for being freewheeling and kind of countercultural. So it's funny to see these guys hanging out in their jackets and ties. When did that shift happen? Like, was it sort of always freewheeling for its times, or was there a sort of cultural shift over the years?
It was pretty freewheeling, actually. It was pretty, especially in the research areas. I mean, there was a kind of telephone guy culture in the 40s, but by the 50s especially, as I understand it, it started in the theoretical physics labs where they stopped wearing socks. And but there was always such a great amount of freedom that dress codes sort of fell by the wayside. I mean, I think too, placing Bell Labs within the larger culture of work in general, you would wear a tie and a shirt and tie to go to work. So in some ways, I think the dress can be deceptive. That the actual behavior and freedom and the kind of environment was pretty laid back and free, even when like Claude Shannon, the great mathematician at Bell Labs, was working on information theory and digital communications in the late 40s. He'd said, those guys were just, we were all pretty way out, and we just just left you alone. If you had something and you were on something and you had a supervisor who was on board with you, you could just, you couldn't go for a decade, but you could go for a year or two and really just kind of make your own plan. Yeah. Okay. Anyone? No? Okay. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I hope it wasn't too boring.